The convoy of armored Humvees moved sluggishly through the shattered remains of what was once a thriving suburb in Virginia. The asphalt, cracked by mortar shells and the tread of heavy machinery, steamed under the oppressive midday sun, releasing the acrid scent of burnt rubber and decaying drywall. Colonel Elias Thorne watched the desolate landscape roll by through the bulletproof glass, his reflection revealing a face etched with the deep lines of exhaustion and the grey stubble of a man who had forgotten the comfort of a home. He gripped his rifle not with aggression, but with the weary familiarity of a mechanic holding a wrench, his eyes scanning the hollowed-out windows of the abandoned strip malls that lined the road. The silence of the neighborhood was heavier than the humid air, a suffocating blanket that pressed down on the young soldiers sitting in the back of the vehicle. These were boys, barely out of high school, drafted into a conflict that had turned neighbors into enemies and picket fences into barricades. Thorne could hear the rhythmic tapping of a boot against the metal floor, a nervous tick from Private Miller, a kid from Ohio who looked too young to shave, let alone kill. The radio crackled with low, indistinct chatter, a static-filled reminder that they were deep in a contested zone where the lines of loyalty were drawn in blood and invisible boundaries. They were tasked with securing a supply route near an old elementary school, a structure that now stood as a skeleton of steel and brick against the grey sky. As the lead vehicle turned the corner onto Main Street, the familiarity of the setting, a recognizable gas station, a shattered billboard advertising a forgotten soda brand, made the destruction feel personal and grotesque. Thorne shifted in his seat, a sudden, cold prickle of intuition crawling up his spine, a sensation honed by years of combat that predated this domestic nightmare. He reached for the radio handset, his thumb hovering over the transmit button, sensing that the stillness was not peace, but a held breath before a scream. The ambush did not begin with a shout, but with the deafening roar of an IED detonating under the lead truck. The explosion lifted the heavy vehicle into the air like a discarded toy, flipping it onto its side in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The concussion waves slammed into Thorne's vehicle, shattering the side mirrors and rattling his teeth, while the world outside instantly dissolved into a chaotic haze of black smoke and orange fire. Before the ringing in his ears could subside, the staccato rhythm of automatic gunfire erupted from the rooftops and the second-story windows of the surrounding buildings, a coordinated rain of lead hammering down on the stalled convoy. "Contact front! Contact right!" screamed the driver, fighting the steering wheel as the vehicle swerved to avoid the burning wreckage ahead. Thorne kicked the door open before the vehicle even came to a complete halt, the adrenaline flooding his system and washing away the fatigue. He spilled out onto the hot pavement, dragging Miller with him, forcing the panicked soldier behind the cover of the engine block as bullets sparked against the chassis. The air turned solid with dust and debris, reducing visibility to mere meters, isolating every soldier in their own private bubble of terror. The roar of the firefight was overwhelming, a cacophony of shouting men, exploding munitions, and the terrifying snap of supersonic rounds passing inches from their heads. Thorne peered around the tire, his eyes watering from the smoke, trying to assess the enemy's position, but the ambush was well planned. They were caught in a classic L-shaped kill zone. The enemy, whoever they were today, insurgents, separatists, former countrymen, had the high ground and the element of surprise, pinning the unit down on the exposed stretch of road. Panic began to set in among the troops. Thorne could hear it in the frantic screams over the comms and see it in the wide, terrified eyes of the men around him. They were returning fire blindly, spraying bullets at the brick facades without aiming, their discipline crumbling under the sheer weight of the assault. Miller was curled in a fetal position, clutching his helmet, his weapon forgotten in the dust, muttering a prayer or a plea for his mother that was lost in the din of battle. Thorn grabbed the boy's vest, shaking him violently to snap him back to reality, shouting orders that were swallowed by the sound of a grenade detonating nearby. It was in that momentary gap between explosions that Thorn saw the movement in the center of the street, a small, incongruous shape amidst the carnage. Through the swirling grey smoke, roughly 50 meters ahead, a civilian car had been caught in the initial blast, its doors blown open and its windshield shattered. Crawling away from the burning wreckage was a child, a boy no older than 8. Wearing a bright blue t-shirt that stood out like a beacon against the drab tones of the battlefield. The boy was dragging his leg, crying out with a mouth wide open in a silent scream, disoriented and terrified, completely exposed to the crossfire. The sight struck Thorn with the force of a physical blow, freezing him for a microsecond as his brain processed the impossible horror of a child in the kill zone. The enemy fire was chewing up the asphalt around the boy, kicking up spurts of debris, while the soldiers on Thorn's side were too suppressed to notice anything but their own survival. The boy collapsed near a concrete median, covering his head with small, trembling hands, a fragile island of innocence in a sea of violence. Thorn looked back at his men, realizing with a sinking heart that they were breaking. The squad leader in the rear was already signaling a retreat, popping smoke grenades to mask their withdrawal. The order to fall back echoed down the line, a siren song of safety that promised an escape from this metal hell. Thorn watched as his soldiers began to scramble backward, abandoning their positions, their instinct for self-preservation overriding their training and their duty. They were leaving the street, leaving the burning trucks, and unknowingly leaving the boy to die alone in the dirt. Thorn felt a heavy, cold weight settle in his chest, a realization that the war had finally stripped away the last veneer of honor, leaving only fear. He looked at the retreating backs of his soldiers, then back at the small figure huddled on the road, the distance between them measured in flying bullets. The tactical manual was clear. Prioritize the unit, minimize casualties, disengage from a losing engagement. But the manual did not account for the eyes of a child who had done nothing to deserve this war. Thorn tightened his grip on his rifle, his knuckles turning white as the internal compass that had guided him through decades of service spun wildly, searching for true north. The smoke from the smoke grenades began to fill the street, creating a thick, artificial fog that offered a fleeting chance, a narrow window of opportunity. Thorn stood up, not retreating with his men, but holding his ground, a solitary figure against the tide of withdrawal. He looked at Miller, who was crawling backward, and gave a sharp, definitive shake of his head. The decision was made not in his mind, but in his blood. He turned his back on safety and faced the kill zone, his eyes locked on the spot where the blue shirt lay motionless. The retreat was chaotic and messy, a breakdown of order that resembled a rout more than a tactical withdrawal. Soldiers tripped over debris and each other, their movements jerky and desperate, driven by the primal urge to put distance between their flesh and the enemy's guns. Thorn stood like a stone in a rushing river, the only stationary object in a world of frantic motion, the wind of passing bullets tugging at his uniform. He could hear the screams of his sergeant calling his name, urging him to fall back, but the voice sounded distant, as if coming from another dimension. To his right, a machine gunner abandoned his heavy weapon, the tripod clattering to the ground as he scrambled for the cover of an alleyway. Thorn watched the discipline disintegrate, understanding the fear, but despising the result. These men had been trained to fight, yet the reality of urban combat on their own soil had broken their spirits. The enemy, sensing the wavering resolve of the convoy, intensified their fire, the rhythmic thumping of a heavy-caliber machine gun tearing through the thin walls of the surrounding houses. The air was thick with the copper taste of blood and the sulfur of gunpowder, a sensory overload that threatened to shut down the mind. Thorn dropped to one knee behind the wheel of the Humvee, assessing the geometry of the battlefield with a cold, detached precision. The boy was pinned down in the median, effectively in no man's land, a strip of death where the converging lines of fire met. To reach him, Thorne would have to cross 40 meters of open ground, exposed to shooters on the rooftops who had a clear line of sight. It was a suicide mission, a statistical impossibility, yet the image of the boy's terrified face had seared itself into Thorne's retinas, overriding the logic of survival. He looked at his rifle, a piece of high-tech engineering designed to take life efficiently from a distance. In this moment, however, the weapon felt heavy and useless, a tool of the very violence that had put the boy in danger. He realized that firing back would only draw more attention, escalating the volume of fire directed at the area where the child lay. To save the boy, he had to stop being a combatant and become something else, something that didn't fit the binary logic of the battlefield. "Colonel, move! We're leaving!" screamed a corporal from the edge of the smoke, his face masked by grime and terror. Thorne ignored him, his focus narrowing down to a singular tunnel vision where only the boy existed. He began to unbuckle his heavy tactical vest, the ceramic plates that protected his vital organs clattering to the asphalt. It was an act of madness, shedding his armor in the middle of a firefight, but he needed speed, agility, and perhaps a gesture that signaled he was no longer a threat. The psychological toll of the war weighed heavily on him in those seconds. He remembered his own son, grown and distant now, and wondered if anyone would have stopped for him. The conflict had hardened the hearts of the nation, creating a callousness where civilians were viewed as collateral damage, obstacles in the path of victory. Thorne felt a surge of anger at the retreating soldiers, at the enemy on the roofs, at the politicians who drew the maps, and mostly at himself for having played a part in this tragedy for so long. He took a deep breath, inhaling the toxic cocktail of the burning street, and felt the familiar slowing of time that came with extreme danger. The sounds of battle seemed to stretch and warp, the sharp cracks of rifles deepening into dull thuds. He checked the flag patch on his shoulder, the stars and stripes now stained with soot, a symbol that had become complicated and heavy. He wasn't doing this for the flag anymore. The abstraction of patriotism had evaporated, leaving only the concrete reality of a bleeding child. The enemy fire shifted slightly, tracking the retreating soldiers, creating a momentary lull in the immediate vicinity of the median. It was now or never. Thorne threw his rifle to the ground, a definitive metallic clatter that felt like a renunciation of his trade. He stood up fully, unarmed, his hands empty and open, his silhouette framed against the burning wreckage of the lead vehicle. For a split second, the sheer absurdity of his action caused a pause. The shooters on the roof must have hesitated, confused by the sight of an officer standing unprotected in the open. Thorne didn't wait for them to process the image. He launched himself forward, sprinting with a desperate intensity, his boots pounding against the debris-strewn pavement. He was no longer a colonel. He was a human being racing against the mechanics of death. Bullets began to snap around him, kicking up dust at his feet and buzzing past his ears like angry hornets. He didn't weave or zigzag. He ran in a straight line, his eyes fixed on the small bundle of blue fabric. His lungs burned, his legs pumped, and every nerve in his body screamed that he was about to die. He could see the boy clearly now, the tear-streaked face, the blood soaking the denim jeans, the eyes squeezed shut in anticipation of the end. Thorne felt a tug on his sleeve as a bullet passed through the fabric of his uniform, missing his arm by millimeters. He didn't flinch. The fear that had paralyzed his men was absent in him, replaced by a crystalline clarity of purpose. He was running toward the one thing that still made sense in a world gone mad. The distance closed. 20 meters, 10 meters, 5. He didn't slide. He dove, throwing his body over the boy as a fresh volley of gunfire chewed up the concrete median. He landed hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him, but he immediately curled himself around the child, creating a human shield of flesh and bone. The boy gasped, his eyes flying open, wide with shock, looking up at the stranger who had fallen from the sky to cover him. The world contracted to the space between Thorn's chest and the asphalt. He pressed the boy down, his heavy body forming a protective dome, his face inches from the terrified child. The ground shook with the impact of rounds striking the other side of the concrete barrier, sending chips of stone flying into Thorn's hair and neck. The smell of the boy, sweat, dust, and the metallic tang of fresh blood mixed with the scent of Thorn's own fear, creating an intimate, suffocating atmosphere. "Stay down, son. Stay down," Thorn whispered, his voice raspy and urgent, though he doubted the boy could hear him over the roar of the battle. The boy was trembling violently, his small hands clutching Thorn's shirt, his fingers digging into the fabric as if holding onto a lifeline. Thorn could feel the wetness of the boy's wound against his side, a warm, sticky reminder that time was running out. He wasn't just a shield, he was a clock counting down. Above them, the dynamic of the firefight began to change. The sight of an unarmed man shielding a child had disrupted the rhythm of the engagement. The heavy machine gun fire from the enemy positions stuttered and then stopped, replaced by sporadic, hesitant rifle shots. It was the break, the moment where the dehumanizing narrative of war fractured under the weight of an undeniable human act. The shooters were no longer firing at coordinates or uniforms. They were firing at a man protecting a boy, and that reality required a different kind of conscience. Thorn winced as a ricochet sliced across his calf, a sharp, searing line of pain, but he didn't shift his weight. He looked into the boy's eyes, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. "I've got you," he said, the words a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. The boy stared back, his eyes glassy, finding a strange anchor in the weather-beaten face of the old soldier. For a moment, the war didn't exist. There were only two people lying on the road, connected by the fragile thread of survival. From the alleyways where Thorn's unit had retreated, silence had replaced the panic. The soldiers, shamed and confused, stopped their withdrawal and turned back to watch. They saw their colonel, the man they thought was hard as nails, lying exposed in the street, weaponless, bleeding, covering a stranger. The image shattered their fear. It wasn't an order or a speech that turned them around. It was the raw, silent power of sacrifice. Suddenly, a single shot rang out from the enemy side, hitting the pavement near Thorn's head. Then, a shout echoed from the rooftop, not a command to fire, but a command to stop. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" The voice was angry, cracked, but authoritative. The shooting died down, tapering off into an uneasy, heavy silence that was louder than the explosions had been. The dust settled slowly, revealing the tableau in the center of the street. Thorn dared to lift his head slightly, scanning the windows. He saw a silhouette in the broken window frame of the second floor, a sniper, rifle lowered, looking down at them. There was a hesitation, a suspended moment where the entire logic of the war hung in the balance. The enemy was looking at the flag on Thorn's back, but more importantly, they were looking at the boy underneath him. The humanity of the situation had pierced the armor of ideology. Taking advantage of the lull, Thorn shifted his grip, preparing to move. "We have to go," he grunted, grit in his teeth. He couldn't stay there. The truce was fragile, born of shock, and it could evaporate in a second. He gathered the boy into his arms, lifting him with a strength he didn't know he had left. The pain in his leg flared, white-hot, but he ignored it, focusing on the mechanics of the lift. He stood up. It was the most dangerous moment. He was fully exposed, a perfect target, holding the boy against his chest. He turned slowly, not running this time, but walking with a deliberate, steady pace back toward his lines. He didn't look at the enemy. He didn't look at his men. He looked straight ahead, his jaw set, his body acting as the shield for the boy's back. The silence held. No one fired. It was as if the battlefield itself was holding its breath in reverence. The only sound was the crunch of Thorn's boots on the glass and the soft whimpering of the child. He walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and for the first time in his life he felt no evil, because he carried a burden that was pure. As he neared the alleyway, the spell broke, not with gunfire, but with movement. His soldiers surged forward, not to retreat, but to help. Miller was the first, rushing out from cover, his eyes wide with awe and shame, grabbing Thorne's arm to support him. "I got you, Colonel. I got you," the boy soldier stammered, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. They pulled him into the shadows, into safety, as the medic rushed forward. Thorne collapsed against the brick wall, his legs finally giving out. He didn't let go of the boy until the medic gently pried his fingers loose. He leaned his head back against the rough brick, gasping for air, his chest heaving. He looked out at the sunlit street, now empty except for his discarded rifle and the burning wreck. He had broken the rules of engagement, but he had kept the rules of humanity intact. The immediate aftermath was a blur of frenetic activity, contrasting sharply with the strange stillness of the walk. The medic, a woman named Alvarez, worked rapidly on the boy, applying a tourniquet to his leg and packing the wound with gauze. Thorne watched from his seated position, refusing treatment for his own leg until the child was stabilized. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a deep, aching coldness in his bones and a trembling in his hands that he couldn't control. The atmosphere among the platoon had shifted fundamentally. The fear that had driven them to retreat had been replaced by a solemn, focused intensity. They set up a perimeter with a renewed discipline, guarding the alleyway not just to save themselves, but to protect the act they had just witnessed. They looked at Thorne differently now. The distance of rank had vanished, replaced by a profound, silent respect. He wasn't just their commanding officer, he was the man who had done what they couldn't. Miller sat next to Thorne, offering him a canteen of water. The private's hands were shaking. "I ran, sir," Miller whispered, his voice cracking with guilt. I ran." Thorne took the canteen, the water tasting of plastic and metal, and looked at the young soldier. He didn't offer false absolution or harsh judgment. "We all run, son," Thorne rasped. "It's about when you stop." The words hung in the air, a heavy truth that Miller absorbed in silence. The extraction chopper was inbound, the thump of its rotors audible in the distance. The enemy fire had not resumed. It was a bizarre, unspoken ceasefire, a mutual acknowledgement that the day had seen enough blood. Thorne wondered about the sniper in the window, wondered if that man was also sitting against a wall somewhere, questioning the war, questioning why he hadn't pulled the trigger. The boy's survival had forced everyone on both sides to look in the mirror. Alvarez signaled that the boy was stable enough to move. She looked at Thorne, her eyes grim. "He's lost a lot of blood, Colonel, but he's going to keep the leg. You got him here in time." Thorne nodded, a wave of exhaustion washing over him so powerful it almost knocked him unconscious. The physical pain of his grazed calf was now throbbing in time with his heartbeat, a grounding rhythm that kept him tethered to reality. As the Black Hawk helicopter descended into a nearby clearing, kicking up a storm of dust and trash, the soldiers moved to carry the boy on a stretcher. Thorne limped alongside them, refusing the support of his men. He needed to see this through to the end. The wind from the rotors whipped at his clothes, stinging his face, but he didn't blink. He watched as they loaded the small stretcher into the belly of the bird. The boy, groggy from morphine and shock, turned his head one last time. His eyes found Thorne in the crowd of uniforms. He didn't smile. There was no happiness in this place, but he held Thorne's gaze for a long second, a look of recognition and shared trauma. Then the doors slid shut, and the machine lifted off, carrying the innocent away from the war, leaving the guilty behind on the ground. Thorne stood watching the helicopter disappear into the grey sky. The silence returned to the unit, but it was different now. It wasn't the silence of terror. It was the silence of reflection. The soldiers began to gather their gear, checking weapons, preparing to move out. The war was still there, waiting for them, but something had broken inside the mechanism of their blind obedience. The radio crackled. Command was asking for a sitrep, demanding to know why they had halted, why the objective hadn't been secured. Thorne took the handset. He looked at his discarded rifle, still lying in the middle of the street, a steel artifact of a previous life. He didn't retrieve it. He would pick up another weapon eventually because the war demanded it, but he knew he would never hold it the same way again. "Solid copy, Command," Thorne spoke into the radio, his voice flat and weary. "Objective compromised. Casualties sustained. We are regrouping." He didn't mention the boy. He didn't mention the retreat. Those were things that couldn't be explained in a tactical report. They belonged to the men who were there, a secret weight they would all carry home. 3 days later, the unit was back at the forward operating base, a sprawling complex of tents and barriers on the edge of a captured airfield. The noise of the base, generators, trucks, shouting, was constant, a stark contrast to the hollow silence of the ruined suburb. Thorne sat on the edge of his cot in the officers' quarters, staring at the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light coming through the tent flap. His leg was bandaged, a clean white dressing that felt foreign against his dirty skin. He had been recommended for a commendation. The story had spread, as stories do, mutating and growing with each retelling. They called him a hero. They said he had demonstrated extraordinary valor. Thorne felt a bitter taste in his mouth at the words. He hadn't advanced to win a medal. He had advanced because the alternative, watching a child die while he did nothing, was a spiritual death he couldn't survive. He walked out into the evening air, the sun setting over the jagged skyline of the American city in the distance. The smoke from cooking fires mixed with the smell of diesel. He saw Miller and a few other boys from his unit sitting by a fire pit, cleaning their weapons. They went quiet when he approached, standing up out of respect. Thorne waved them down. He didn't want their awe. He wanted them to survive this war with their souls intact. "He made it," Thorne said simply, breaking the silence. "The boy, the hospital called. He's with his aunt in Ohio." A collective breath seemed to leave the group. Smiles broke out, small and tentative, on faces that had forgotten how to look young. It was a victory, not a strategic one. They hadn't taken the town, they hadn't defeated the enemy, but a moral victory, a proof that they were still human beings beneath the Kevlar and the camouflage. Thorne walked away from the fire, towards the perimeter fence. He looked out at the darkness beyond the wire, where the war waited. He thought about the flag patch he had ripped off his uniform that night to press against the boy's wound. He hadn't replaced it yet. The Velcro on his shoulder was bare. He realized that courage wasn't about killing for a country or fighting for a flag. Those were abstract concepts, lines on a map. True courage, he understood now, was the ability to see the individual through the fog of the collective. It was the refusal to let the hatred of the many justify the death of the one. He lit a cigarette, the flame illuminating his tired face for a brief moment. He was a soldier, yes, but for those few minutes on the asphalt, he had been a savior. And that was enough to keep the nightmares at bay, at least for tonight. He looked up at the stars, the same stars that shone over the enemy lines, over the ruined suburb, over the hospital in Ohio. The war would go on. There would be more ambushes, more retreats, more death. But Thorne knew that he had changed the equation. He had proven that even in the deepest hell, a man could choose to be a guardian. He crushed the cigarette under his boot and turned back toward the lights of the base. He would lead his men again tomorrow. But he would lead them differently. He would lead them not just to fight, but to remember what they were fighting to protect. The colonel walked back into the noise, carrying a quiet peace in his heart that no bullet could touch.